Making Kansas City a better place to live, work, and play. This Casey Cares segment is brought to you by the Ewing, Marion Kaufman Foundation, www.kaufman.org. As an executive director, running a nonprofit organization is no easy task. There's staff to manage or a lack of staff, fundraising, financial oversight, programs and events to attend, a board to work with, and volunteers to recruit and work with, and so much more. It's running a business despite the tax designation. Statistics indicate the turnover rate for executive directors is between 18 and 22%. The expectation is a nonprofit board can look to navigate a leadership transition every 4 to 5 years. So how can a nonprofit find the right leader for the organization and fulfill its mission? What should a search include? What are the bumps in the road and how can you avoid them? Well, we've gone to an expert in this space as part of our Ask the Expert series, and we welcome back Mike English. He's Vice President for Search Strategies and Senior Search Consultant for the Moran Company, which is based here in Kansas City and conducts these searches on a daily basis. Mike comes to us having been a guest on the show a few years back as an executive director himself of Turn the Page. So welcome back, Mike. We're glad to have you.
Thank you, Ruth. It's great to be here.
All right. Well, we want to share with our audience, you navigated your own search for your replacement and then decided it was so much fun, you wanted more.
Right. Yes, I had been an executive director for some different nonprofit organizations for, about 20 years. And most recently was executive director at Turn the Page KC, a local nonprofit organization. I was there about 8 years. I was ready to move on. I think it was good for the organization too, as this happens, I think for a lot of people in that role. And so we conducted kind of our own search and I was a big part of that and really enjoyed it. So like you said, I've made that transition to working in executive search for nonprofit organizations full time with the Moran Company.
What was that transition like for you? You had been at the helm for so long. So I wonder, jumping the fence.
Right. It was good. I really enjoyed the nonprofit culture and the people in nonprofit organizations, and that includes staff and board. And so in this role, I get to work with nonprofit boards all over the country. And so it's been pretty seamless because it's that's a role I know really well. And so as I do this work, I really enjoy kind of trying to make that match between what the organization needs and people out there that can do it well.
Well, let's dive right in. I started the show with some statistics that I think might surprise some folks. Changing a leader every 4 to 5 years. What's behind that? That seems like not long tenure.
Right. It is, it's not easy work being an executive director. And so there is certainly, I think, some burnout that executive directors face after a number of years. And so I think that's certainly part of it. And, and the person hired isn't always the best fit. And so what we really try to do is make sure that match between executive director and board and organizational culture is really strong and really the right fit so that we get a longer tenure in that organization. So yeah, I think it's the reason behind that turnover is probably simply just, it's not easy work. And it really is important to find a really good match between organization and executive director.
This might be an odd question, but I'm wondering what's like the failure rate overall kind of in the industry when you do go and you hire somebody and it just doesn't work out?
Right. It's a good question. It's for search firms like ours, typically executive search firms provide a 1-year guarantee. And so if the individual leaves in under a year, the company does that search again for free. And so typically firms measure that as the success rate. So, what are the percentage of placements that last the year? And also once a person lasts that first year, they're more likely to be there long term. For us, I think it's over 95% of our placements lasts over a year. And of course, we're doing more and more searches each year. And so we're not quite sure, how long people will last because they're still in the role and hopefully will be a long time. But, when an organization invests in a search and brings in professionals to help conduct that search, in my experience, it's more likely to end up with a long-term placement.
All right, let's start at the very beginning. You're that board president and you get that call, that letter, that email that says, I'm leaving for whatever reason.
Right.
How do you begin as that organization? Take us through that kind of thought process.
Right. The first kind of variable is how long is that person going to stay? What is your notice in terms of when is that person going to leave? If you have ample notice and maybe it's a retirement or it's a person who's just decided to move on, but is willing to stay several months until a replacement can be found, that's ideal. And so what that board president would do and what we recommend that person do is establish a search committee. And so that's a committee of board members, typically, sometimes with staff as well, to serve as that representation of the board when conducting a search. And at this point, this is how we get work. Of course, those search firms will determine they want to hire a firm to lead the search. And so that's when we kind of come in the process and help the organizations. In some cases, or in a lot of cases, unfortunately, there may not be that sort of notice. So that executive director maybe has found a new job and is going to be leaving in a few weeks, or maybe they're leaving abruptly. And in those cases, what most nonprofits will then do is find an interim executive director. And that's an important step in order to provide some stability. And to find that interim executive director, that nonprofit may identify a senior leader within the organization. So maybe your CFO or a chief development officer, someone who they can ask to serve as that interim. A lot of cases, that's a board member will offer to serve as that interim executive director. And then there are people out there that are pros, that are retired executive directors or consultants that can come in and be hired to serve as an interim. So if it's an abrupt departure, an interim can really help to provide that stability while that search takes place. So those are the two scenarios: longer term or a more urgent search, and those are kind of the first steps the board president would take.
How critical is it to find the right person to be that interim?
It depends on the circumstances of the organization. So in some cases, you'll have a nonprofit that's really in chaos or in flux. And if that's the case, it's really important to find the right person to help provide stability, maybe clean up any issues there might be, because you don't want a new permanent executive director to come in to a situation that is chaos. And so that would be the most important time to find a really solid interim, is when there are things that need to be stabilized. In other cases where the organization is in really strong shape, a lot of boards will see this as an opportunity maybe to test somebody out, right? So you've got a senior leader that could be a great internal candidate. And by appointing that person, the interim executive director, and then conducting a search at the same time, they can really, see if that person is successful. So there may be some uncertainty there by appointing a current staff member as the interim, but it's a good opportunity in some cases.
How often do you all encounter, being involved in a search where they say, we don't want that interim as our executive director. We want a caretaker, keep things stable. I'm just curious where that lands.
It's a good question. I would say about 50%, in my experience, will have a board that if there's an interim in place, that person is going to be an internal candidate for the position. And you might be thinking, well, why would you even do a search if you're going to appoint an interim that you may end up hiring? Well, for one thing, is that what I mentioned before, it's an opportunity to give that person a chance to prove themselves. But then also, I think by it provides credibility to that person if they are ultimately hired as the permanent executive director, because they provided or they conducted a search. So in other cases, the expectation is that the interim executive director will not be a candidate for the job. And it's important to be upfront about that with that interim executive director. And so in those cases, that's about another half of the searches that at least I've been a part of where there is an interim. The expectation is that person will be there just as a caretaker.
I want to circle back. You had said, setting up that search committee, it's usually some board members, may include staff. What's your opinion about also bringing in, I guess I would say, clients, recipients, the people that you actually serve with what your nonprofit's mission is? Is that part of the mix?
It is. And I think that's a really important part of the mix in terms of gathering feedback and input on the attributes that the organization should be looking for. And so in all of our searches, we conduct interviews and surveys of recipients, of clients, of stakeholders at the very beginning, and then develop what we call the position profile that then helps us work on that search. And so I think no matter what, that's a very important first step. In terms of the search committee itself, that's the committee that is going to be interviewing and ultimately making the decision about who to make the job offer to. And so in most cases, that is limited to board members. And in some cases, staff will be a part of that as well. To a lesser extent, general community stakeholders or clients are part of that.
So the search committee's together, you're doing the homework at the beginning of what do we want in a leader, an attribute survey, I guess, or what is it we're looking for? How important in that part of the process is it what we're not looking for?
Very important, very important. So that once that recruiting starts or that posting of the position is made, then everybody understands what you're not looking for, because there may be some very strong candidates on paper that the organization, there's maybe some, it could be a management style or a personality style that the organization knows would create conflict with staff. And if you do know that, then that may be a management style you can avoid. For example, if an organization, and a lot of nonprofits are this way, are really looking for a collaborative leader, then you know that you're not looking for sort of a very top-down, my way or the highway way type leader. And so then during that outreach and those interviews, the search committee knows, okay, well, this is probably not the best fit for our culture.
How do you really ascertain that? As you said, people look great on paper.
Mm-hmm.
How do you find that out? If somebody's this is how I run it, this is how it goes, or I love to sit around and have that cup of coffee and really find out what it's all about.
Right. I think the first thing you do is you ask them, and there are clever ways to do that in an interview. Because when you ask about a person's leadership style, most people are going to give an answer that they think you want to hear, right? And maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But by asking about scenarios and practical examples, there are ways to really uncover what their management style is. And those questions that I find are most helpful are about conflict. So how do you handle a certain conflict? Give us an example. And those questions can help ascertain what that person's management style really is. And then, of course, if it's a finalist candidate and you're doing references, that's something that you can really find out by checking references.
So we kind of jumped over you've got the job description, you put it out there in whatever places, and are there places that you would recommend that you should absolutely be posting these kinds of positions?
Yes, for sure. If it's Kansas City, the Nonprofit Connect is the probably go-to place for posting nonprofit jobs and executive director jobs. Since we work in cities all over the country, we typically try to find that type of nonprofit association or organization to post that position. And then the there are a number of different job sites nationally that we typically use that help us to find candidates by sector, or some that are good at helping to generate a more diverse portfolio of candidates. And then, of course, LinkedIn is really emerging as a great place to circulate positions and get candidates. I would say for our searches, we probably get over 50% of our candidates see the job or hear about it from LinkedIn.
That's interesting. We're talking with Mike English, the Moran Company. He's filling us in on all those critical things that we should be doing if you're looking for an executive director. Mike, so you've got the job description out there. It's floating around in all the appropriate places. How long do you wait to start, saying, okay, we have enough? And what is that critical number?
Well, so we put a time limit on it. So we put about a 6-week recruiting period. So once that position is posted, we have it posted, an application portal open for 6 weeks. And during that time, we're doing active outreach as well. So some of the best candidates you'll find for a job they're not necessarily looking. And so by getting the word out, talking to lots of people, we're able to kind of uncover or new candidates that may not see that on a posting. So after about 6 weeks, we then move quickly into that final phase, which is evaluating applications, identifying who we want to interview, and then moving through a few rounds of interviews and to kind of narrow the field and find the perfect candidate. So I wouldn't put necessarily a number of applicants number out there, but a time period is a good way to. You may have 100, you may have 200 candidates, you may have 20, but if you're doing your recruiting, your outreach well, you'll have the right person at the end.
Okay, so going back to that search committee, then who conducts the interviews? Sometimes search committees are really big. Sometimes they're not so big.
Right.
Who does the talking or the asking?
I like a search committee that's got maybe 4 or 5 people on it. And so during the interviews with the candidates, and to do multiple rounds of interviews, we find it's a good start to do it over Zoom. And so over Zoom or whatever platform you use. And so that way you can, interview several people over Zoom in a first round and sort of divide up the questions or the topic areas is a good way to make sure that the full committee is engaged and participating and talking on the call and asking those interview questions. So, and then after that, sort of what we call the Zoom round, that maybe that initial round or that semifinalist round of candidates, then it's important to bring them in person. And so then that search committee, again, will interview maybe 2 or 3 kind of finalist candidates. And then at that point, a nonprofit has to decide, do we want the full board to have a say in this hire and be part of that interview process? Or are they delegating that decision-making power to the search committee? And that really varies by the type of organization and the size of the board. If the full board is going to be a part of that interview, then there's typically structuring that around a board meeting may be the most sort of convenient way to set that up. And then and then it's just up to the nonprofit how they want to handle that interview at that point.
Let's talk about questions. What do you ask? And what can't you ask?
Yes, that's good. That's a good question. We have a whole list of questions that we can't ask that we always provide our clients. And so those are, obvious legal questions, like you can't ask a person's age or their marital status, religion, those kind of things. And then in terms of questions to ask, I like to match up. We talked about that position profile that's developed at the beginning. Mm-hmm. I like to make sure we're matching up our questions with what we're looking for. And so the jobs usually entail some leadership, working with boards of directors, managing people, raising money, understanding finances, communicating internally and externally. Those are sort of those general topic areas that we try to ask questions about. And then, as I mentioned before, those questions are most effective when you can really drill in and ask for concrete examples of how much money has the person been responsible for raising. That's usually an important question for a smaller nonprofit. They want to make sure that the person can raise money. So matching up those topic areas with what you're looking for, and then asking for a person's experience, maybe their point of view, perspective, or strategy, and then trying to drill in on specific examples is a really good way to make sure you're getting what you want in an executive director.
How long should that interview last?
I would say the way we handle interviews is we like to interview a lot of people. And so our initial round of interviews, we may have 20 people. And so each of those interviews are usually about 30 minutes. And then we kind of narrow the field to maybe 5 or 6 people. And then that next round of interviews will we schedule those for about 45 minutes to an hour. And then have a final round, which is usually over an hour with the individual. And because it's a executive director role, it's also important to make sure that there's an opportunity for that person to really ask a lot of questions. So at this point of the interview, the candidate is in a way interviewing the organization as well. And so setting that final interview where there might be 2 or 3 candidates for about an hour and a half to 2 hours. That's a good length of time to make sure that you're getting everything you need to know about the person, but also they're getting an opportunity to make sure they want the job.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I've heard people talk about going through interviews like this, and they come out, they feel like they've been interrogated, but nobody really, allowed them to ask a few questions. So that's such a key critical point. How important, or I'm trying to find the right way to ask this, how critical is it for that final candidate or two to be able to have some interplay with the staff?
It's really important on both sides. So you're going to if this is the person you want, you're going to offer them the job and you want them to accept the job. And most people are not going to be comfortable accepting that job until they've met the staff. And so there should be an opportunity for them to meet the staff. And then on the other side, you really want to make sure that the staff feels part of the process, like they had a chance to the person before they're being hired. That can be a little tricky, setting it up in a way so that the staff has input and has a role, but may not be a formal interview with the staff. And so I like to set those meetings up as somewhat less formal, where the candidate meets the staff. And so that ultimately when that person is hired, the staff feels comfortable, and the candidate takes the job because they've had a chance to meet the staff and they feel good about where they're going.
I'll ask this question. I think I probably obviously know the answer, but I'll let you, the expert, answer. How does a nonprofit decide whether they do this internally versus going to a company such as Moran?
Yes. We get a lot of inquiries from organizations that are trying to decide that. And so a lot of it depends on budget and whether they have the resources to pay a search firm to do the search, and as well as their own capacity to do it. So if a nonprofit feels like they have the expertise on their board and the time to put in the process, then in a lot of cases, they'll decide to do it on their own. And one thing I want to stress about the time commitment is that to do a search and get a good result, there really needs to be a lot of effort into that recruiting and that outreach to find candidates, because you can post a job and you may just not get a lot of interest in it. Because like I said before, a lot of the best candidates aren't looking. They're not looking at those job boards. And so you need somebody to do that outreach. And so if the board has the time and the capacity to do that, they could do that on their own. But if the organization is really, wants to bring in professionals, and that's where we get hired to come in and kind of lead them through the process. Because it's probably the most important thing you'll do as a board member for a nonprofit organization is to make a hire of a new executive director. And so obviously I'm biased, but I think that working with a search firm is really important in order to make sure. It may cost some money, but you're making sure you're getting that right person. It's an investment you're getting. It'll really benefit the organization in the long term if you find the right person.
All right, we're at the point that you've got the candidate. That's the person you want. How long should it take between "we want you, Mike," versus Mike giving a decision?
Right. I would say not more than a few days. So
okay.
It's because what's happening at this point too is you have gone through this process and you've narrowed the field down to maybe 2 or 3 people. And in most cases, there's a favorite, but there are also others that would also be great. So when you make that offer, you don't want it to drag on too long, because if you do, and the person ultimately declines the offer, then you may have lost your other individuals that you also like. And so so what search committees often do is prepare an offer letter with a date by which they expect a reply and a decision. And so if it's a Friday where that offer is made, maybe giving that person the weekend to think it over and make sure that they're all in, and then hopefully get that decision by Monday.
Gotcha. I was going to ask, what's the percentage of people that get offered and say, "Oh, thank you"?
I don't know. That's a good question. It does happen. What the searches we're involved with, it's a pretty rigorous process. And we do have a lot of discussions with candidates to make sure that they're committed to this, that they're really all in. The other thing I try to do is make sure that we're upfront about the salary from the get-go. And so the salary, I think can be one reason people decline an offer, probably the biggest reason. But if that person really knows, and we remind them throughout the process, this is the salary range. Are you comfortable with that? Does that work? Then when the offer is made, that's not going to be a reason they decline that offer. But what can happen is a person may, if they're looking for a job, they might be entertaining other opportunities as well. And so in some cases, they'll decline your offer because they're taking another job. So that's another thing to be cognizant of when conducting a search, is you may not be the only suitor for this person. And so again, that's another. Once those interviews start, I think it's important to kind of be efficient about the process. Otherwise, you may lose candidates.
We've just got a couple minutes left. Tell us some real big don'ts. Instead of do's, what are the don'ts?
Well, I think so. One big don't, I would say, we talked a little bit about internal candidates before. And so I think it's important to be very transparent with that internal candidate about the process. So one don't, I would say, is to treat an internal candidate unfairly or poorly during the process, or allow them to have the perception that they were treated unfairly or poorly, because that person will then leave the organization. And that's probably a valuable part of your organization. And so we try to make sure that those internal candidates, it might be the CFO, the development director, whoever it is, feels good about the process, so that they don't leave. So that would be one don't. The other, I would say, is, and this is my personal opinion, don't hide the salary, because again, that's probably the biggest reason why this can fall apart at the end, is if a candidate had different expectations about what that salary is going to be. And then finally, I would say, don't let it drag on. We have our process takes about 12 to 14 weeks from start to finish. Once it's posted, I mentioned we have a 6-week recruiting period. And then once interviews take, it's usually 3 weeks or so. from when we schedule interviews to when an offer is made. And so what can happen with a busy board of directors is that scheduling gets in the way. And then all of a sudden it's, 3 weeks in between each round of interviews. That you're going to lose candidates during that time. And so I always recommend setting up your schedule right at the beginning for everybody. So put that, semifinalist and finalist round of interviews on your calendar right now, so that nothing gets in the way once you get to the end. Because if you drag it on too long, you're more likely to lose really good candidates just because they find something else.
He's Mike English. He's with the Moran Company, and they've got some great resources. So you should check out their website, www.morancompany.com. Mike, thanks. This was great. I'm so glad to get you on as the expert. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're produced by Charitable Communications. This KC Cares segment was brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, www.kauffman.org. To be a guest on KC Cares or to go find any of our Ask the Expert or other episodes, go to our website, kccaresonline.org, and spread the love. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at KC Cares Radio and Instagram at KC Cares Online. And don't forget, you can catch us Saturday morning at 8 a.m. on ESPN 1510 AM and 94.5 FM. Thank you for joining us on KC Cares.